Welcome to our next talk in the series for 2023. I've known Jim Hardee now for, I figured out, 20 years. And he's one of those people that whenever we catch up and I ask him what he's been doing lately, and he talks about, well, I've been talking here, speaking. That's our heavy metal introduction. He'll say, well, I've been speaking here and doing presentations there, and I've got a new book coming out and all of that. And he'll say, what have you been doing? And I'll say, I mowed the grass. But he is one of the most prolific people I know in this interest. And it's a pleasure to introduce him. His talk today will be about the Shoshone people and their interactions with the mountain men and how the two cultures rubbed off on each other.
Thank you, Scott. And how cool is it to give this presentation on Ringo Starr's birthday? 83 today and still rocking. Isn't that amazing? So, mountain men and the Shoshone. We're going to use a lot. Okay, that didn't work. Boom. We're going to use a lot of images that were painted by Alfred Jacob Miller. Most of you are probably familiar with him. He's the only artist who ever came to a Rocky Mountain Fur Trade rendezvous. Came out in 1837. He has a body of work that's well over 600 images, and many of them include Shoshone people. So every now and then the pictures will actually line up with the topic, but for the most part, I want you to see images of Shoshone people that were inspired by his visit here in 1837. This is the only image we have of a trapper actually doing his work, and it was done by Alfred Jacob Miller. This is not a Shoshone, but this represents the mountain men that came into the Rocky Mountain West during the fur trade era hunting for beaver. Now, these guys were coming into a region that they were not familiar with. They didn't know the land, they didn't know the landmarks, they didn't know how to necessarily live in the changing environment of the Rocky Mountains. So who are they going to learn that from? The Shoshones and the other people in the regions that they're in. It just dawned on me that I left my notes in the car. Would you do that? Because I would invariably leave out some really critical piece that I wanted to get across to you. Just hit the beeper because I don't know where it is. The paper's on the front seat, but Melissa borrowed the car, so I don't know where she parked it. Okay. So we're gonna wing this, okay? So the trappers are moving into the regions that are inhabited by native peoples, and those are the people they're learning from. They're learning how to get along out there. And many of the men were in the areas that were claimed by the Shoshone bands. They're not really a nation, they're very loosely oriented. So ethnologists will tell you that the Shoshones aren't really a nation so much as they are a cultural group that's made up of a number of different bands. When we look at the idea of mountain men trading, it's important to realize that trappers did not teach Native Americans how to trade. The trading had been going on, intertribal training, for centuries, and there were major rendezvous areas. The idea of rendezvous didn't get cooked up by William Ashley. The Native Americans have been doing rendezvous for trade for centuries. One of the key ones was right here in southwestern Wyoming, and it was run by the Shoshone people. Other key ones were up here in the upper Missouri River, over on the Columbia Plateau, and down in the Southwest country. And one of the key pieces for Shoshone trade was horses. Here's where the horses are getting kind of groomed. They're getting up to the Shoshones, and then from Shoshone, they're proliferating out throughout the Rocky Mountain region. And the Shoshone were very powerful in the mid 1600s because they had horses so early. Horses just totally changed the balance of power. You could ride through a village, make a couple of arrow shots and ride out of that village before the people that you're fighting against could even get their bow strung. Okay, so the balance of power shifts dramatically during the horse indoctrinations. But when the guns come in, the horse loses its abilities to be a benefit, because now I can shoot you before you get here. I can shoot you from a long ways away. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. Yeah, I guess we do, don't we? All right. So these guys are master traders. It's nothing new there. Now, the Shoshone people, this is not going to be an in-depth history of the Shoshone people, but they did call themselves the Newe, the Nuwa, the Numa. We see different spellings and different pronunciations of that cultural criteria. And nowadays, and shortly after the fur trade even, we began to categorize them as Eastern Shoshone, Western Shoshone, and Northern Shoshone. But during the fur trade, they were just Shoshone. Alexander Ross described the boundaries of Shoshone territory that maps out to this green line. Okay, and that's in the early 18 teens. Alexander Ross had a lot of interactions with Shoshones early on. And then in the 19th century, Smithsonian ethnologists began to really analyze, okay, so where are the Northern Shoshones, where are the Eastern Shoshones, and where are the Western Shoshones? So when you compare the sort of oral history of what fur traders thought compared to what more scientific modern thinking would be, it's not terribly far off. And these little green dots, that is all of the rendezvous sites between 1825 and 1840. And where are they? They're all in Shoshone country. Okay, so it's no wonder that the mountain men are constantly interacting with Shoshone. One of the difficulties that we have is that virtually anybody, any Native American that shows up in this region, whether they're Ute, Paiute, Crow, whatever they are, they're oftentimes identified as Crow. So we have to be very careful in looking at particularly where are those trappers. And if they're up in this region, maybe they're Northern Shoshone, but they might even be Salish or Nimipu. We have to be very careful about how we identify those. So the idea of being a Shoshone, we don't really know where the word comes from. Lewis and Clark called them the Shoshone, spelled it with a CH, a Shoshone. The Shoshone word for tall grass is Shoshone, and that may be part of the derivation of the term. And the tall grass is important because the Shoshones lived in areas with tall grass and oftentimes used that to weave into shelters. The idea of their hand sign being like this, they're saying we weave our shelters out of grass. But French trappers are looking at that and going, oh, Jean de Serpent, you're a snake man. Okay, and so the nickname for Shoshone very quickly and very thoroughly becomes snake. We see snake pop up over and over and over in the journals. The trappers are calling these people snake rather than Shoshone. And the Snake River is named for the Shoshone people from that moniker of snake, not because the river runs like a snake, but because the Shoshone people who are called snake live along that river. And so those are the boundaries. Now, the other piece about identifying bands comes from what they eat. They oftentimes are identified as sheep eaters or pine nut eaters or salmon eaters. And this is what their name for themselves were. If they were Tukadika, they were sheep eaters, okay? And we can look at these names and get a general idea of where they probably were. And so trappers aren't giving us a whole lot of this, but when we look at where they are when they're writing in the journals, if they're in the Yellowstone area, we can look on a map and say, okay, well, those guys are probably sheep eaters. And then we will know that that's that Wyoming, Montana, Idaho corridor where the Shoshones are living. Mountaineer diaries seldom contain enough detail to really decipher bands without looking at where they are and trying to tie that into to their food sources. But though even that can change, because a root digger, who was oftentimes called a shoshoko or even a digger, could go and hunt elk, and then he would become an elk eater. There was some shifting and some transition that was going on there. A lot of the digger Indians didn't have horses, so they were often referred to as walkers. But if they acquired a horse, now they're a full-blood Shoshone. They're not a digger anymore. So there's this fluidity that goes on, and so it gets pretty tricky trying to look into those journals and pick out what we're going to talk about. Now, the British were here pretty early on, with the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, and they provide a lot of early data on their interactions with the Shoshone. But they're very class conscious. The upper echelon is the gentlemen of the forts. The guys who are running the brigades are traders. They are engagés. They're hired people. They have their free trappers, which differs from what we call free trapper. They actually call them free men. We call them free trapper, but they're different enough. A freeman in Hudson Bay still had to sell his goods to Hudson Bay. He still had to buy his goods from Hudson's Bay, not like a free trapper who could go anywhere. But they're another step down that social caste. Native Americans were at the bottom of that, even below what the Hudson Bay calls slaves. They're almost equivalent, but they're way, way down the cultural chain. But they provide a lot of early insight, like that boundary issue that Alexander Ross presented. Peter Fiddler tells an interesting story in 1792. He was up in the Alberta, Canada area, what's today Alberta, Canada. He said, I lighted a pipe with a burning glass that was fixed in the top of my tobacco box. He eyed me, this Shoshone, he eyed me all the time with the most circumspect attention. But when he saw the pipe actually smoke, by means of that glass, he jumped up and wished to be farther from me, as he thought I was something more than common to light a pipe without fire. So these Shoshone people who had come from their area up into Alberta had not had much exposure to Euro-Americans, and that was the reaction of this particular Shoshone. These root diggers that Miller paints, this guy's got a mule, and it's sort of interesting that so many times the trappers, they didn't have horses, but Miller paints this one with a horse. We see oftentimes in British diaries and almost as frequently in American diaries, using words like poor and wretched, and primitive and miserable, even savage, things that we might look at as being fairly ethnocentric today. But with the trappers from Britain, it was pretty ethnocentric. With American trappers, it seems to feel a little more matter of fact. When they call a digger, they're not using that word derogatorily, but we see that change as more and more Americans come into the West. When you get into even the California getting settled, digger became a very derogatory term, so much so that about 4 years ago, they changed the name of the digger pine to the gray pine, just to I don't know, to be more politically correct, I suppose. The Americans are getting onto the scene around 1805. That's when the Lewis and Clark expedition runs into Kamehameha's band up in the Limhi area of Idaho. And it's interesting that William Edmo, who is a Native American historian that grew up on the Fort Hall Reservation, he says that, well, I had my little, that's not Sacagawea, but that's my, in my attempt to put a little Shoshone girl in the story. He says that this first experience that Shoshone had with white men must have been a good one. It's not really known what the Shoshone thought of Lewis and Clark because it wasn't recorded, but it suggests that they must have marveled at the equipment and trappings. What is evident, Edmo says, is that Kamehameha's goodwill toward the expedition resulted in a spirit of trust between the Shoshone and the white men in the first contact. And it wasn't until about 1810, 5 years later, that we have an expedition of Euro-Americans moving into Shoshone country, and that's the group led by Andrew Henry and Pierre Menard into the Three Forks area. As they're working that way, they run into pretty disastrous snow condition where most of the men go snowblind. And Thomas James says, in this distress situation, enveloped by thick darkness at midday, 30 Snake Indians came among them and left them without committing any depredation. Brown, who was a trapper, and another who suffered less than the others, saw and counted these Indians who might have killed them all and escaped with their effects, but left them in perfect immunity. So they were willing to help these trappers get through their encounter with snow blindness and not rip them off. So these St. Louis, Missouri Fur Company trappers built a fort at Three Forks. And that was an area that was sort of a crossroads for a number of different tribes, Blackfoot, Crow, Hidatsa, and Shoshone. That's the Three Forks area is where Sacagawea had been captured several years prior to, as the Shoshone had moved out towards the buffalo plains for their buffalo hunts. Henry doesn't mention any contact with Shoshone, but it's pretty clear that the Shoshone knows he was there, because in 1811, the next year, when Wilson Price Hunt comes in, they get to the Hoback Junction and they decide that they can't go down the Snake in boats, so they have to get over Teton Pass. A couple of Shoshone men come along, they go, can you get us to Henry's fort? And these two guys say, sure, follow us. And they go over what Hunt describes as a well-traveled trail up over the Tetons and right out to Fort Henry. So these guys knew where Fort Henry was, even though Andrew Henry never mentions anything about them. Of course, Andrew Henry doesn't have a journal that might have mentioned it, but what I thought was even more coincidental, it was in 1812 when Robert Stewart is coming back, that those same two guys who had led Wilson Price Hunt over the Teton Pass are over towards the Boise area now. Robert Stewart meets them and they talk about what has gone on before, and they go, you know, that those guys last year, they really went a long way. So you need to go down here and go over this other pass. It was South Pass. These same two Shoshone men introduced Robert Stewart to the concept of South Pass, which eventually becomes the main trail to get the immigrants across the Continental Divide. Hunt trusted those two guys enough to show them where he cached all the saddles and left them in charge of all 60 of their horses until somebody comes back. Well, nobody ever went back, so those guys got away with a pretty good haul. Now, as we'll see as we go along, supposing that we don't run out of time, the Shoshone really helped to establish and ensure the survival of a lot of these mountaineers. They shared food, shelter, information that allowed these newcomers to succeed in the land of which they were unfamiliar. Trapper Osborne Russell says they are kind and hospitable to whites, thankful for favors, indignant at injuries, and but little addicted to the theft in their large villages. I have seldom heard them accused of inhospitality. On the contrary, I found it a general feature of their character. They're people. They're people. And Osborne Russell is realizing that they're my neighbors. And so they start getting along. Osborne Russell is one of the first to learn the Shoshone language and becomes so involved with the tribe that when he writes his journal, the Journal of a Trapper, there's a whole chapter in the back devoted to Shoshone. Same with Warren Ferris. Warren Ferris talks about Shoshone a lot. And when his book is published, there's an entire section in the back devoted to Shoshone. So these mountaineers are making requests for assistance, direction, other exchanges of information, and they're banking on the Shoshone providing them the information that they're going to need to get along. Here's a map that was done in 1836. This is the Tetons, just to give you an orientation site. But all of this area is the Shoshone area. Here's the Sioux. This is going up to Missouri. You got the Sioux and everything up through here, up to the Assiniboines. Here's the Blackfeet area. But all of this is Shoshone. And this is how we interpreted their lands as a cartographer in 1836. So Snake Country expeditions had been in going into that Snake River drainage since as early as 1818 with Donald Mackenzie. And that continues on with the Hudson's Bay Company. And eventually that area is getting pretty well trapped out. 9 different HBC brigades over the next 2 decades invade those Shoshone lands looking for beaver. But by 1831, work is having to find other places to go. Ogden, in one of his later trips, goes into Nevada all the way down to Baja looking for beaver. So then we get Americans coming in. 1824, we get some of the Henry Ashley group crossing over South Pass, getting down onto the Green River. Trapper James Kleiman talks about their first contact with Shoshones. We found a small family of Shoshone on our trapping grounds who we feed with the overplus of beaver. Our digger friends moved off without our knowledge, and with our horses running loose one night, they all escaped. We continued to trap on foot with fair success for about 6 weeks. We cached our traps and furs, hung our saddles and horse equipment on the trees, and set out for the Sweetwater. That same day, about noon, we turned a point of a ridge and we met face to face with 5 or 6 Indians mounted on our horses. So they're able to kind of get their horses back and move on. I know I'm starting to ease up into John's time, so I better move along here. Let's see. So for these Shoshones to start attending rendezvous was not unusual because they'd been going to those trade fairs all along. We don't know for sure that they were at the 1825 rendezvous, but they were at 26, 27, 33 through 37, 39, and 40. So 9 of those rendezvous, there's specific mention in the journals of Shoshones being at the rendezvous. And of course, the most notable is that 1837 event because Alfred Jacob Miller is there to paint all the images that we now have. I'm gonna skip a little of this here. Not surprisingly, though, interactions between these 2 cultures were not always smooth. The majority of the dealings, though, were relatively easy, relatively well. They came off okay. There was research done by archaeologist Mary K. Rusko, and she demonstrated that nearly 85% of the encounters between Indians in that Snake River country and trappers were positive. Positive from the standpoint that no one was hurt, nothing really bad happened, okay, as opposed to that other 15% where there was some more hostile physical interaction. Rusko based these numbers on 10 journals from trapping expeditions that went into the snake drainage. She found 359 references to Native Americans for which the season, if not the actual date, could be calculated. And she narrowed those down to 289 firsthand accounts. So instead of Joe saying, hey, we heard that this happened, she just went with those 259 firsthand events. And of those, 85% were positive. That's pretty cool. So Mountaineer journals, which is what most of this is all based on, give us a pretty good idea that the trappers are generally getting along with their neighbors here. Even late in the period, though, it wasn't unusual to have Shoshone to be somewhat fearful or surprised by groups that they didn't know a brigade might move into an area. Frederick Wieslesinus, he crossed over the fork of the Bear. He said, we met a band of Snake Indians, and the first who saw us took to flight before us. But when we convinced them that we were friendly disposed, they came in crowds to our noonday camp. They're a peaceable tribe. So initially they were unsure, but it didn't take long for them to understand that, hey, we can do this together. And along they go. The Shoshone gradually became more accustomed to having Euro-Americans in their neighborhood. In the summer of 1830, Warren Ferris recorded that a village of Shoshone camped just a few miles from the mountaineers. Some of them paid us a speedy visit, he said, and testified their friendship by giving us each a hearty hug. So, and John Wirt talked about a band of mounted Shoshones riding around the camp 3 times and firing off the guns in what Jacob Miller Alfred Jacob Miller and Joe Meek would call a feu de joie, a fire of joy. They're blasting their rifles to say, our guns are empty, we're here for peace, we're here to get along. Now, food was a difficult thing for these trappers to understand. They had to learn how to kill a buffalo. You didn't just blast that thing, you had to hit it in the right spot. Different animals that they'd been eating back east, they weren't necessarily finding in quality. Pronghorn antelopes, they didn't have those back east. So they're learning which animals they can eat. They're also learning what other kinds of edible plants might be out there, like tubers. Camas, biscuit root, yampa, bitterroot, and wapato were all tubers that Shoshones ate. And we see numbers of times in the journals where the trappers are learning to eat these tubers based on their interactions with Shoshone. In 1806, Meriwether Lewis is recording that Sacagawea is constantly digging tubers. And given the fact that Coulter, when he goes on his survival run and he comes back and he tells Thomas James that he survived on tubers. So he must have been paying attention when Sacagawea was digging these roots. Interesting story, when the expedition is in good meat country, they're eating up to 10 pounds of meat per person per day. But when they get up into the low mountains and they can't find food and they're eating their candles, and they drop down then into the Nez Perce country, and the Nez Perce start feeding them camas, it changes their system. Camas will create a very gaseous situation. Clark recorded that our tents were so full of wind, we could scarce stand ourselves. I think they call those fartichokes. Okay, my bad. I figured if Jim could say fart, I could say fart too. Oh, let's see. Mountaineers sometimes found themselves needing items that they just couldn't get at Rendezvous or didn't have access to right away, but that they could get from the Shoshone. Bonneville, when he was camped on the Bear River, discovered a small band of Shoshones, and he purchased lodges, furs, and other articles of winter comfort and arranged with them to camp during the winter. And we see a lot of this inter-camping going on. I think there's a nice camas root painted by our good friend Tim Tanner over there. Be sure you get the one with the purple flower. The one with the white flower is no good. That one is the death camas. That'll do you in. You don't want to go there. Let's see. A lot of times the trappers married into the Shoshone tribe. They married women that were Shoshone. Bill Swaggerty did a survey some years ago, and he found that 40% of the men in his sample who had married for the first time, 40% of the men who had married the first time married Native women. And a pretty high percentage of those married Shoshone women. So the trappers were drawn into these new complex kinship systems, and it became this intercultural union where white men are gaining trading and status privileges, but the wife is gaining power and status within her tribe as well. These women become important laborers within the fur trade brigade with their husbands, oftentimes working as camp tenders who prepared the hides and made the meals, kept the men in footwear and clothing. And that freed the husband up to trap longer, trap farther, and be more productive. So the whole idea of trapper marriage, I'm almost caught up with all my skipping, was very prevalent. And as much as we hear that, when they left the country, they left their native wives behind, that's not as prevalent as you think. There's a lot of trappers who stayed with their native wives, stayed with their native families, and kept them together as a family unit. Let's see, there was an interesting gender division of labor within these tribes. The women oftentimes worked with gathering, preparing foods, and producing material goods and controlling their distribution, while the men were hunters, protectors, and they are the ones who went to war. So we have these gender-specific tasks that are going on, and the mountain men just jumped right into that. That worked for them. It was a system of complementarity, is what ethnologist Adam Hodge calls it, complementarity, or parity even. And it seemed to work out pretty well. Oh, I'm sorry, John. The frequency of Euro-American commerce, though, within some portions of the Shoshone territory that didn't have much of a beaver population, still caused this slow incursion of Native Americans with Euro-Americans. John Ball, when he's traveling in 1832, he said that they met Shoshone that seemed very friendly, and they sold us their salmon for such of our goods as they seemed to need, awls of iron to prick the deer skins for sewing, knives, for they hardly possessed an article of manufacture. They had sharp bone for awl, they had one flattened for a chisel, they had stone knives and hatches, and we all seemed to them a great curiosity, for their country, being poor in furs, had not been visited by traders. So as much as these trappers are moving into this vast territory, they're still not connecting with every single band that's out there. During those cold months, they oftentimes camp together. Jim Beckworth describes a scene on the Weber River in 26-27, where the beaver hunters had set up their winter camp, and they were joined by an encampment of Snake Indians to the number of 600 lodges. Now, Jim Beckworth has a tendency to overestimate, but it's still a large number of people. They had entirely surrounded us with their encampments, adding very materially to our present population. They were perfectly friendly, and we apprehended no danger from their proximity. It appears that this was their usual resort for spending the winter. So these trappers had set up unknowingly in lands where this Shoshone band typically wintered. Here we see the little brown teepees. That's the traditional wintering grounds of the Shoshone. The green is where we see Rocky Mountain Journal saying the trappers throughout the fur trade wintered, and you see how often they overlap. This comes from an article by Carrie Oman about wintering grounds, and work that was done by Robert and Yolanda Murphy on the Shoshone subsistence areas. So in the interest of time, here we go. I'm gonna just jump over here and wrap it up because I don't want to take John's time. John's got some valuable information for us. But essentially, relationships between Shoshone people and trappers were in the main pretty positive for both peoples. They got along pretty well. Period records are replete with evidence that supports this, at least from the trapper perspective. We don't have journals and written documents from Shoshones. So all that you've heard today is based on what the trappers are saying in their journals. And in many respects, the fur trade, as short-lived as it was, found success because of these Native American interactions, not in spite of them. It seems telling that those two mountaineers, Warren Ferris and Osborne Russell, spend so much time in these large sections in the back of their book talking about the Shoshone people and the relations that they had with them. Anthropologist Preston Holder detailed how during the fur trade era, individuals from two vastly different worlds met in their common humanity to exchange gifts and ideas. And in the process, Euro-Americans sometimes became more than half Indian, and certainly Indians took on many European ways. Ethnologist Finn Liljebald, who is one of the most trusted ethnologists amongst the Shoshone people, and I think probably because he wasn't an American, he was from the regions of Norway and over that direct Sweden, I think. He considered the Rocky Mountain fur trade to be a time of prosperity and mutual amity between Shoshones and whites. Bill Swaggerty, an article that he did in the journal just a couple of years ago, he said the decline of the beaver trade, the rapid increase in traffic on the overland trails, and the first experiments in Western treaty making contributed to a jaundiced view of the future relative to the idealized past. But in the last fleeting moments of a period where Indians and whites came closer to achieving a bicultural understanding of each other than in any other historic time, many mountain men, as well as their Indian, Métis, and Mestizo associates, were understandably distraught with the reality of the new economic frontiers. Things drastically change when immigrants come because the resource that those immigrants wanted was land. or the resource the trapper was looking for was food and beaver. So the mountain men as a group were probably more biculturally aware and responsive to their neighbors than any other social group that comes into the West in that 19th century. I'm going to wrap it up there. Should we take a couple of questions if we have them, or move right on to John? We are 7 minutes behind schedule. Yes, Clay.
About the Shoshone's boundaries, that first map you showed, the
Yeah.
anthropologists put together,
Right?
it didn't reach up into the Three Forks. And didn't we learn from Adrian that that was an area of conflict from 4 different tribes, and he included Shoshone in that, didn't he?
Yes, and if you recall, when I talked about that Three Forks area, that's that crossroads of not only Shoshone, but Blackfoot, Hidatsa, Crow. A lot of tribes are moving through there, particularly on their way to the Buffalo Plains.
Yeah,
That's where Sacagawea gets captured.
That's where she got captured.
Yeah.
And that's why the conflict was there, because that was a major part of the route to the Buffalo.
Right.
For those mountain tribes.
Right.
So, but that map didn't look like it reached up into that area, was my concern, I guess.
Well, let's see if we can find it here real quick.
That's all right.
So yeah, it doesn't. Here's the Yellowstone coming down into, where's the Three Forks going to be? Right in, well, it's right in this general area. Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty close. It's pretty close. I didn't even really get to talk about Alfred Jacob Miller. There was some really good stuff in there, but we're just out of time. It's in the article. Buy the journal, read the article. Don't forget the endnotes. There's good stuff in those endnotes. But I will. It's there. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is John Fisher, and John has rapidly become a friend of the Museum of the Mountain Man. He is. I'm gonna lead him by the leash here.
Or where it's kind of out.
There you go.
I have a question.
Okay,
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
If the Nez Perce and the Shoshones both got along really well with Lewis and Clark, how come they didn't get along with each other?
That's a good question.
I don't know.
Yeah, probably just cultural distinctions that go back centuries. You know, one time, a long time ago, Chief Whitehair's dog, you know, pooped on the teepee of the Nez Perce guy, and it's just been battle ever since. I'm making this up as I go here, folks, right? Let me introduce you to John Fisher. John Fisher, like I say, has rapidly become a very good friend with the Museum of the Mountain Man. John is an all things Lewis and Clark expert, and that knowledge extends into the 1820s and 30s. Incredibly well read, incredibly well versed in all that he talks about. You're going to enjoy what he has to tell you today. Without further ado, John Fisher.
Oh, there we go.
We'll want you to stand up here, John, otherwise the mic's gonna get through.
Pardon? I wonder, can I stand up here? Can you hear me here? I like to work from around my, is this working? Oh, the first time I gave this in 2018 at Bismarck, I wasn't feeling well, and I told my friends who'd seen it before, said, if I don't feel well, just if I fall, you know, if I drop to the ground, just drag me off and finish the show for me. And a few hours later, I was in the hospital, damn near death with pneumonia. I hope things work out a little bit better this time. I am not an expert in the fur trade. I'm not an authority. I'm barely fluent. Every time I hear a presentation from my good friend Jim, I learn so much more. So I'm not an expert in that area. However, I have spent more than 20 years studying about medicine of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I expanded that to the ledgers that some of these authors of fur trade journals, and I went through them in detail, and I tried to gather up all the medicines that I could find that were mentioned. Now, unfortunately, too often they don't tell how they used the medicine. They just said, well, they carried the medicine or it was in the journals. And so then well, let's take a look here. Bleed, blister, purge, and clister. I'm going to give you a chance to read what's up there, and I'm going to throw out a few extra comments, kind of like the rest of the story, like we used to hear on TV. Tom Holloway, who was earlier speaker at the beginning, gave me some ledgers from the Fort Vancouver, 1820s through 1840s. And I thought I knew all about the medicines because I'd gotten all these medicines from Lewis and Clark, about 60 of them, and then later on, as I'll mention, from another book. But at any rate, all of a sudden I had almost 200 medicines to research and write up. So he was already mentioned. They had access to the very best medicine that was available in Europe. 200 medicines. They had birthing tools. They could do anything, and they had not only Dr. McLaughlin, but they also had other physicians on staff during most of that era. So for when you got to this site, you could get the very best medical treatment. But let's look at our next slide. The smaller outfits probably had a medical chest like I have set up in the back of the room. This is very much like what Lewis and Clark carried. It's what you might find in Jefferson's plantation, what Dr. Rush had. They had maybe 60 different medications. But when you get out into the fur trade country, like in our next image here, this is what I discovered this. I threw this into the show just a few days ago. Some of these little fur trapping sites, they probably had almost nothing. And that's probably what the fur trappers most of the time had nothing more than what were available from their Native American wives, friends, shamans, medicine men, and so forth. Well, let's go on and let's take a look at people who helped me. He's got a lot of great information. Actually, he's done a monumental job. There's no way a person could praise him too much. He's done some editing of my work. He provided me with this next book, which we're going to see here, please. Not this one, but some of these others. They had, there were lots of medical books that were available in the 1800s. Most of them were written by physicians for physicians. But let's go on to the next. They're hard to read. And so the one that Jim Hansen gave me from the Museum of the Fur Trade was this one, Domestic Medicine. So anybody who was literate could take this book and probably do about as good job, and maybe even some cases better, than trained physicians from England or some of the new medical universities that started in Philadelphia area. So I use this. This has about 170 different medications that was available. And I don't know how often it was used, a very rare book. Let's go on. So when a physician starts writing a book for the common man, you can imagine what the professional university trained physicians thought about. And really very insulting, but they produced during that era about 8 or 10 different domestic medicine books so that you can, if you could read, you could find out how to treat a disease, how to treat an injury. There was other major sources of information during that era, and that was botanical volumes written by botanists like Douglas. Almost every of those European expeditions that you read about coming to the West to study the culture, almost all of them had artists and or plant collectors, and that material went into these volumes. Very easy to read. Now, overall, how was the medicine of that era? I really get upset with a lot of physicians and so-called PhD scholars when they talk about how bad the medicine was, because it was really a lot better than it's been characterized, generally speaking. They did a pretty good job correcting when there were injuries, but when it came, could you back it up for a second? But when it came to diseases, they were not as good. And the reason, because they didn't understand the sources of the causes of diseases, as in bacteria. Thanks. Now, this gentleman has done some pretty definitive books on Native American medicines. And there's no way I could ever, I don't think anybody could absorb all the information in these books. And it's interesting, some of the Native Americans use a medicine or herbal medicine for one thing in one culture, and yet you go to another tribe and they use it completely different. Next, please. I want to talk about the placebo effect. In my analysis, in my textbook or my recent book that I just published and I provided to the presented in 2018 at Bismarck, it's hard to overemphasize what we're looking at here, because what you believe has a huge effect on your physiology and so therefore, even if it's a bad medicine, it can still have a good effect on the body, or at least that's the way you feel. And this is really important in understanding the effectiveness of medicines from cultures all over the world. Next, please. So now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Let's get down to the instruments. A lot of these instruments are in the back of the room, and I'd be happy to spend as much time as anybody would like to discussing the tools and the instruments specifically. These were bloodletting instruments, all of them, except for this one right here has been sold frequently as a bloodletting instrument. That's actually an ink eraser. If you're writing with pen and ink on hard paper, when it dries, you simply scrape it off. But it could have been used for bloodletting. This one right here, I was talking to the blacksmith outside this morning, and that's a blacksmith-made bloodletting tool. This is a gum lancet. I wish I'd have had that when I was traveling to Tibet about 25 years ago. I had an abscessed tooth and I had to use my Leatherman. This would have worked a lot better. So of about 90 medicines that were, about 90 diseases that were discussed in Thomas's book, and remember that's a book went out to the fur trade installations, at least the, what was it, American Fur. All of these, they suggested bleeding. And that goes back centuries, this idea that you had 4 humors in your body. You had black bile, you had yellow bile, you had phlegm, you had blood, and there was an imbalance within your body. And that goes back, as I said, centuries, a couple of thousand years, this philosophy of an imbalance of fluids. And so they thought, well, let's take some blood out. And they might take out a few ounces. They might take out a few ounces, maybe 5, 10, 16 ounces. If you're still sick the next day, if you were with a physician like Dr. Rush back in Philadelphia, they might take another 16 ounces a day after, and 2 days, 3 days. Washington had too much blood taken out, and that probably caused his death. That is George Washington. Next, please. Now, besides bloodletting, in order to get those fluids that might be causing you problems, this young man here has, let's say, a shoulder problem, little bursitis, little arthritis. Well, what we could do is we could take a blister, hard to get at that just by taking blood from his arm. We might just put a big blister on his shoulder, let it build up fluid, drain off that fluid, and that would solve our problem. Of course, you would feel the pain from the blister and maybe less so from the arthritis. Next, please. Purging. I have about 30 or 40 medicines back there out of 200 that are designed to give you diarrhea, to purge you, to laxatives. Purging, let's say, is a little more severe. Laxatives, we tend to think is maybe a little less severe, but the results are the same. And in no cases, well, in some cases, purging might have been useful if you had a bad amoeba or something in your system. Here's some examples of the purging. Calomel is a mercurous chloride. It's probably the strongest purgative that we have that they used. Hallop was one of the other strongest herbal medicines, and putting these two together, you've got Rush's pills. Those are the famous pills of the Lewis Clark expedition. I had carried 50 dozen of them. I haven't yet found them in any fur trade. You would know more about fur trade. Have you ever heard them mentioned in fur trade? But I did find Scott's pills. Well, we'll talk about Scott's pills maybe later, but which were similar. Sulfur and cream of tartar, that was a very common, more gentle laxative of the expedition. Next. Emetics. Antimony potassium tartrate. If you put wine in antimony flask, if you have antimony, which is similar, let's say, to lead or tin, if you have antimony and you put wine in there, it produces antimony potassium tartrate. And if you leave it in overnight, you drink the wine the next day, you will be seeing whatever you ate the previous day. Pretty nasty stuff. Next. Clister. Also sometimes spelt and pronounced glister, that is with a G. And of course, that's an enema syringe. I've got a small one back there, but they range for humans from about this size to about this size. When you get up to this size, then we're using it on your horses or cattle. And they use the same basic materials that we would use today. If you need to lubricate the colon, to get rid of your costive or constipated nature. Next, please. There's where we might use a clister. It would seem that with all the purgatives that they carried, that you should never have to use that. But turns out on the Lewis and Clark expedition, the only one that needed it was baby pomp. So Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, who became one of the most famous men in the fur trade, when he was a baby, he had a little clister of probably oily water. Next, please. Snake oil. You know, they had them back then and they have them today. And I have some examples of snake oil. Let's go on to the next one. Rattlesnake rattle. Well, stay with rattlesnake rattle for a bit. Okay. So here's a really interesting situation where we have what we would call, what we white folks might call a placebo event. Because Shoshone, am I pronouncing, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the French correctly. I'm sure Jim could correct me. But anyway, Shoshone was with the Amanda and Hidatsa for about 10 years before Lewis and Clark showed up. Well, Sacagawea was pregnant with Charbonneau's son, and she had a tough delivery. Very young, first baby, very tough delivery. And it turns out my research suggests that women who had babies, Indian women who had babies with white fathers tend to have a more difficult birth. There seems to be some evidence behind that, and maybe someday I'll get it published. But anyway, Jessime gave Lewis a couple of a rattlesnake rattle, and she got a couple of crushed rattlesnake rattle. And here we see an example of a Native American medicine used for to help in birth. And it turns out that a number of tribes all across the country believe that the rattlesnake chase scared the child out, and that caused it. But what actually happened, it probably so affected her psyche that those Pitocin or oxytocin kicked in and kicked out the kid. Next, please. So syphilis and gonorrhea, that is commonly mentioned in the Lewis and Clark papers and occasionally in some of the other fur trade journals. And these were the original plants that were used to treat syphilis back in the 1500s. It became clear after about 100 years these didn't work. But what really did work was, do I have mercury next, Jim? Let's see if we have mercury. Ah, yes, there we go. I have lots of mercury in the back, so if anybody has suffering from a STD, well, I'd be happy to treat you. I have the real stuff. Blue mass was made out of chalk, and it took about probably days to make this stuff, mixing chalk and mercury. Now, you folks have all, you look like you're all about the age that you played with mercury when you were kids. Well, almost all of you. And if you've ever thought about trying to mix mercury and chalk, it just doesn't mix. Well, it takes days, hours, days. My first batch of mercury right here, I'm mixing it, and the mercury keeps running around the lard and the grease, and this isn't working. I'm looking at the book, and it says it works. I've got a blister after an hour and a half. Then I end up reading it took 8, 10, 12 hours of mixing with a mortar and pestle to get the mercury to look like this. This is real mercury ointment. I scored a few weeks ago buying something out of the Southeast. That's real mercury ointment by Eli Lilly and Company that dates to the 1920s because they were using mercury all the way up to penicillin. Well, I'm going to run out of time here in a moment, but that's okay. We'll have time for questions. Let's go on. That's how we dealt with gonorrhea. Some pretty nasty things, some alcohol solutions. Imagine, gentlemen, an alcohol solution with camphor in it in your urethra. Others that would cost less pain was the zinc and the acetate. You've heard of Spanish fly, certainly us older folks have. This was a chemical that this beetle sprayed out to protect itself from other predators. Well, they took this beetle, crushed it up, put a little grease and oil in it, and this is genuine blistering ointment, probably from the late 1800s. And I do have some of that back there. Next, please. Probably the single most important medicine of this era for disease and fever was cinchona bark. The only thing it was really good for was for treating malaria, or as they called it back in those days, fever and ague. They couldn't do much with these. They tried all these medicines we've talked about. They really couldn't do much about these diseases. Next, please. And we're going to quit here in just a couple more minutes. Very effective. These are really effective medicines. They were effective painkillers, and paregoric and laudanum were very effective for diarrhea. If you had cholera or one of those diseases that is just exhausting your system, if you've had opiates in the hospital, you know it'll bind you right up. I remember when my appendix was burst because my buddy, the doctor, didn't recognize it soon enough. And they fed me this, I had opium drip in my I looked like I was about 6 months pregnant with a big belly full of gas. Really good stuff for, and nothing better today. Smallpox. Mike Kessler did a great article a few years ago on smallpox epidemics. I recommend if you read that, when they used to inoculate with actual smallpox, and when you do that, you get a mild case. But if somebody is next to you and gets it from you, then you can get a severe case, which is interesting. The vaccination was started by Jen. That's an actual vaccination knife, because if you put your pustular material on a metal, the metal will kill the thing. It lost its virtue. Lewis was sent out west with some cowpox, and he reported to Jefferson it had lost its virtue. Well, I want to give you time to ask questions. We're just going to stop now because there's a lot more to talk about, but I'll take questions from the audience. Maybe it's something I didn't get to. I'm deaf, so I'm going to need some help from questions. Challenge me. Yes, sir.
Have you heard of a Dr. Physic in Philadelphia in the 1840s?
You know, somebody was just telling me, asked me about that at Great Falls. And no, I haven't. I just heard about him at Great Falls, that there was a Dr. Physic. I tend not to get to that era. That's a little bit after, but somebody said they had a relative or something that was in their family.
One thing, remnants of his gardens are still there.
Oh, yeah.
I can't tell you precisely where that is. I do know that John Doherty, if you know that name, he was on his way from Fort Leavenworth to Liberty on a sleigh in the winter. He hits a tree stump or something, and the sleigh rolls over his testicles. John Doherty cannot stand up or walk for nearly a year and a half, and he's told about Dr. Physic. And he goes up there, and part of the treatment had to do with having somebody hold you up in the corner to sleep, as Dr. Physic proclaimed to him this would be helpful. And all we know is that John Doherty came back and he was able to walk and ride horses again.
You know, miracles occur in every culture. And there's, you know, if you're taking some really bad medicine, you get better, you know, it may be because you were going to get better anyway, or you might have been just one of those victims of a good miracle. Yes, sir, question.
Could you talk about mustard plasters?
Do what?
Mustard plaster?
Yeah, and your question is, what is it?
Yeah.
It's simply mustard seed. You know how mustard can burn you, or, you know, especially Chinese mustard? Yeah, well, what you have is they'll take that and they'll grind it up and they'll put a little lard or something in it. I had the raw material back there. I could make one up right now. But anyway, yeah, you just simply take mustard and grease or oil, or maybe olive oil or castor oil, and you mix it up, you put it on a cloth, you put it on, and that will burn your skin. Well, it'll heat your skin. And what we have here is a counter irritant. So if you've got a chest cold or you've got a sore leg or something like that, you put that on there, you feel the warmth. It's like icy hot. It works the same way. Yes, sir.
A related question. I have a copy of Andrew Henry's probate file. Dr. Israel McCready from Minor Breton, or which became Potosi, traveled 10 miles down to the town of Webster to minister medical aid to Andrew Henry, who's on his deathbed. Dr. McCready's probate file says he administers 10 hours of medicine and attention. Part of that was putting 5 blister plasters on the abdomen of Andrew Henry. And I understand from what I've read that then raises the material that supposedly is causing the harm in his gut, and then you pop it. But that's not a mustard plaster, is it?
Well, there's you've got blistering plasters. Remember the cantharides I talked about? Well, when you put that cantharides, as I mentioned on our poor victim over here, you put that, it raises a blister and you drain it off. That's what he was doing. He's probably using cantharides. When he said he raised blister with a chemical, that would have been cantharides. You see, the book that I've written on all these medicines, I've got the medicines, I've got what they thought they were used for, I have what they actually did. And those questions that you have, if you wonder what he used, well, the answer is probably the cantharides ointment, because that was a common treatment.
The treatment, I think, did fail because what Dr. Israel McGrady thought he was faced with probably was not, because this was June the 6th of 1833. June the 10th, he's called back down there and he's too late and he's dead.
Yeah. Other questions? Challenge me. I love these stories, especially from you guys have so much knowledge that I don't have about events. Yes, sir.
In regard to nutrition, obviously they were eating and they were eating what they could find. They had a very diverse nutrition, yet they seemed to have something in their system. They could eat the rotten meat and the end of their. My question is, how much was nutrition involved in the medicine?
I wanted to, it's really great having Jim ahead of me because he talked about the importance of women. I believe that Sacagawea's most important contribution to the Lewis and Clark expedition wasn't that the Indians could see these guys with guns or that they knew it wasn't a war party. I think her most valuable contribution, as it was for the women of the fur trade, is those women were out there getting roots and berries and fruits and giving the men a balanced diet. I think that is the single most, besides camp and so forth. I think that was extremely important, both for Lewis and Clark, because if you leave it to a guy like me, it's meat, steak, maybe hardtack on the expedition or in the fur trade. But yeah, they were getting their important vitamins and minerals, prevented scurvy, Yes, good question. And thanks, Jim, for helping me out on that.
Thank you, John.
Any other questions? Welcome to come back and look at the drugs before I put them away. Later on, I've got to go back to Lewiston tomorrow. Long trip, but I'd be sure happy to talk drugs with you folks and share. Actually, I love giving the kids examples of, there's some medicines I can give to my fourth graders when I'm doing show and tell with them. Thank you.
Thank you, John. John's book, Medicines of the Fur Trade and the Lewis and Clark Era, is available in the museum. And if you go and get one of those and bring it over to John, he will gift you a copy of his report on Meriwether Lewis's Newfoundland dog. Okay, so don't miss out on that. That concludes our forum for today. Tonight at 6:30, we'll have the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal Awards, where we will be recognizing our authors and presenting them with very special presentations. And following that, we'll have our movie night. We're going to be showing 10 Who Dared. There was a 10-episode series back in the late 70s, and they had one on Jedediah Smith. So we'll be showing that, and then we'll have a panel discussion after that. Tomorrow at 2:00 will be our next session for the forum. We'll have 2 presentations tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget all the other demonstrations that are going on. Visit the museum and be sure and get a good bison burger for lunch tomorrow. Thank you very much.